Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Loom for various early PC systems including DOS, Macintosh, Amiga, so on and so forth, although what you're seeing here is the Steam re-release. This is a point-and-click adventure game developed by Lucasfilm Games and released in 1990, and it's kind of interesting for a couple of reasons. The first of which being that it's one of the SCUMM engine games that tends to go forgotten. People tend to remember things like Maniac Mansion, Day of the Tentacle, obviously the Monkey Island games, even Full Throttle, but they don't really remember the two games that were really spearheaded by Brian Moriarty, which are Loom and The Dig. Now, of course, both of these games are actually pretty weird, both in their subject matter and in the fact that they deviate fairly strongly from what we're used to from these SCUMM engine games, with Loom actually getting rid of the verb system entirely for something that is actually centered around musical notes. Which of course makes it rather odd that this game doesn't really get discussed all that much when you talk about the SCUMM engine games. I mean, obviously Monkey Island was a lot more popular than this, and even Full Throttle was more popular than this. But you never really hear people talk about Loom or The Dig, even though Loom was actually received pretty well when it was released. People generally seem to like it quite a lot, and it's gained kind of a cult following. And that following will of course tell you that the version that is readily available on GOG and Steam, which is what you're seeing here, is the worst version of the game possible. While it did introduce fully voiced dialogue and a re-recorded soundtrack, unfortunately they had a really nasty problem of a lot of the dialogue either being revised or just cut out entirely. And almost as bad as that is the censorship. This game was actually censored a couple of times, first when it was released on FM Towns, where a bit of the blood was cut out of the game, and then when they re-released it in the talkie version, it was censored even more heavily, with the blood being basically removed entirely. And I'm still kind of baffled as to why they did that, because the game was never particularly graphic to begin with. Now, unfortunately, I have not played the original release or the FM Towns version. All I have played is the CD re-release talkie version that they put up on Steam, so I'm playing the worst version of the game here, unfortunately. So if you're a fan of that, just understand that going into this review, and even worse than simply playing the talkie version, unfortunately, the Steam version does not come with the audio drama. This thing actually released with a 30-minute audio drama that really gives you the backstory to the world that you're in, and if you don't have that, you basically have no idea what's going on. And unfortunately, even the GOG version doesn't have that. All these things come with is the manual, and that is downright infuriating, honestly. So now that all the disclaimer information is out of the way, let's go ahead and delve into this thing and find out exactly how it is, even without all that stuff. Well, as far as presentation goes, you have a wildly different experience depending on which version of the game you're playing. If you're playing the original DOS release, it was in EGA graphics, and those generally looked fine for their time, but they're definitely very unimpressive by modern standards. The VGA re-release definitely looks a lot better in that. You have a much improved color palette, as well as improved sprite work, smoother animations, more detail in the environments and things like that. But the VGA release also had some serious issues with regards to a lot of cut content, so there's instances of graphics that were in the original release and the FM Towns release that simply are not in the VGA re-release, like the close-ups during conversations. And while that may seem like a rather odd omission, it's actually for pretty practical reasons. The animators had a very hard time actually getting lip sync to work properly for some reason, and so they just decided to cut that particular part out of the game entirely. Sure, it's rather disappointing, but at least you can kind of understand where they came from on that. But it's not so much the rather good visual quality that brings this thing up, as much as it is the art style, which is pure fantasy in really the best of ways. They got really inventive with this, and it is very well appreciated. I mean, I can't really think of any other games off the top of my head that have you going through a city composed entirely out of green glass, for example. And that's just one thing that sets this apart from typical fantasy games, so they definitely did a great job with regards to the artwork. But when you get to the sound design, things get a lot more messy. On the one hand, the game actually doesn't really have any sound effects to speak of, so that's actually a pretty negative thing. Mostly because pretty much everything you're doing ends up being completely silent apart from the voice work and the music that pops in, which is all basically Tchaikovsky. And it's basically one tune that is repeated in various versions over and over and over again, which means that it gets kind of tiring even though the music itself is actually pretty good. The voice acting, on the other hand, is wildly all over the place, which is pretty typical of early 90s voice acting. Some of it is rather decent, although a lot of it ends up sounding rather amateurish and awkward in certain spaces, and even more problematic is the fact that it randomly cuts out. It'll cut out the last bit of whatever somebody is saying, so if they were trying to say, "I opened the door," it would say, "I opened the and just leave it at that, which is really awkward and ends up meaning you have to read the subtitles. And it's there that you can definitely tell that a lot of the dialogue was cut in the talkie version, because certain things just feel unnaturally clipped. But of course, despite that being a mixed bag, it's not really a deal breaker, and what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, particularly the story, because that's what you're really going to be experiencing for the majority of the game. And unfortunately, this is where the Steam and GOG release really drops the ball, partly because it's the VGA version, which was cut down and censored a bit, and partly because it doesn't come with the audio drama that actually is the prologue to the game. You see, if you have the prologue, then you know that the world of Loom takes place in the year 8021 during the age of the Great Guilds, and you play as someone named Bobbin Threadbare, who is brought up among the Guild of Weavers, although he is not taught their craft. You see, in the world of Loom, you have the Great Guilds all hoarding their secret knowledge. For example, the Shepherds hoard the knowledge of how to tend to sheep, the Blacksmiths hold all the knowledge of how to forge things out of metal, and then the Weavers are very special because they have actually transcended cloth and are actually capable of weaving the threads of reality itself, so they can actually just change reality as they see fit. And yet, despite having this power, they don't really do a whole lot with it. Instead, they actually just keep to themselves on their own island of Loom, and they live out their days practicing their craft to themselves. And it's into this that Bobbin is raised, basically as an outsider. Although the woman who ends up raising him, Lady Hetchel, actually treats her as basically her own son, so that does work out for him in the long run. But unfortunately, as the game begins, it's his birthday, and the elders are basically trying to figure out exactly what to do with him, when it's revealed that what they had feared would come to pass is actually coming to pass. The pattern is beginning to unravel, and the elders attribute that to the existence of Bobbin himself, because his mother, Lady Signa Threadbare, actually drew him forth from the loom itself, and thus disrupting the pattern. And the elders actually end up turning into swans and flying off, while Bobbin is left there by himself to basically pick up the pieces. From there, you take control of Bobbin and follow his story as he learns the powers of weaving and basically goes on an adventure all over the place. Obviously, that's grossly oversimplifying it, but to delve too deep into this would get into spoiler territory, and I really don't want to spoil the plot for you, because that is really the main draw of this game. Certainly not the puzzles, even though they have a kind of interesting way of dealing with them. But I'll get to that in a moment. The journey itself is actually fairly interesting. You end up going to some very unique locations, talking to some pretty interesting people, and learning some cool things about the world itself, but then the actual plot kicks in, and it's basically the last fourth of the game where the real plot takes place. And that raises something that is very important to note about this game. There were sequels planned, and it really does show in certain spots where it just kind of glosses over a whole swath of things that could be pretty interesting, and it introduces characters only to have them just kind of fall out of the picture entirely and not really get referenced until the end of the game, and things like that just get rather confusing over time. Even with the audio drama that comes with the game, it really isn't enough to save the plot from the fact that it just feels blatantly unfinished. I mean, the main plot itself ends on a cliffhanger. It's obvious that they planned something in the future with it, but it just never came to pass. So who knows how much they ended up actually cutting out of this game to begin with just to meet a deadline or something like that. But the end result is a game that just feels incredibly disjointed and blatantly unfinished, which is a real shame because the world is interesting. I want to know more about it. I want to actually understand what's going on for the most part. I have a basic idea from what the game told me, but it feels like there was just huge swaths cut out in mid-development that would have actually explained things a lot better and made it a lot more of an interesting game. Especially considering that once you get past that, the actual gameplay interactions are little more than a gimmick. It is a point-and-click adventure game, and it takes a different style than what we're used to from LucasArts adventure games. We're used to the verb interface system, so you would have a series of verbs at the bottom of your screen that you would click on, then you click on things in the environment in order to enact that verb on it. So for example, if you wanted to say open a door, you would click on the open verb and then you would click on the door and it would open the door. In this one, you have the distaff, which is a staff that has a bunch of musical notes that are, for some reason, a thing. It's not really explained. But the point is that all of your interactions are done with this distaff and done with musical notes. So what you end up doing is actually clicking on something in the world to highlight it, and then you click on the various notes in your distaff. And what you're looking for is a 4-note combination known as a draft that will enact some particular feature on that particular object in the environment. So to give you a prime example, there is something very early on in the game that seems like it doesn't really have much use, but you'll learn about what use it actually has later on, that will turn a cloth from white to green. And this is just a combination of 4 notes that you enter into your distaff, and if you've highlighted something that is white, it will turn it to green. And something else interesting about it is that if you reverse the notes, it will actually turn it from green to white. And this is actually pretty significant. You need to remember that you can actually reverse every single one of these drafts, because some of the puzzles in the game actually rely on you doing that. There's only one problem with that. You see, if you weren't told that beforehand, maybe, say, with the manual or something like that, you would have no idea what you're doing. This game does an absolutely terrible job of telegraphing things to the player. I'm not talking about things like holding your hand or making it really easy. I'm talking about basic gameplay mechanics that it does an absolutely horrible job of explaining to you. Which means that if you weren't told beforehand that you're looking for various combinations of notes in order to actually be able to do anything, and if you weren't told beforehand, whether it be through the manual or any other means that you can actually reverse the various drafts in order to create new interactions, then there's pretty much no way you'd really be able to figure it out on your own unless you just experimented with it for a very long time and eventually got very irritated by it. Which is a particularly big problem on the Steam version because you have to go out of your way to get the manual. And thus we're back to that problem I mentioned where depending on the version you're playing, you can have a pretty wildly different experience. I can see where if you're playing it on the original release where it's not censored and it doesn't have the sound glitches and such that this particular version has, that you'd be able to enjoy it quite a bit. If you're from that era, then chances are you read the manual, and chances are you had the audio drama that you could listen to, and you got all the backstory, you got how to play the game. It's not that big of a deal. If you're like me, and you ended up picking this thing long after its prime on Steam or GOG, then you're going to run into problems with it. And going off of what I played, this game is very hard to recommend. It's not for everyone to begin with. Even among adventure game fans, this is a pretty weird game. It's interesting, it's definitely got this great sense of fantasy and wonder about it, but it just feels blatantly unfinished, and it's not the kind of game where you can just pick it up and immediately start playing it no problem if you've played other adventure games. The system of interaction is just so radically different from what we're used to, whether that be a parser-based system or a point-and-click system or the LucasArts verb system. It's just going to take some adjustment regardless, and even then there's really no guarantee you're going to like it. It is a really hit or miss game. It is ultimately going to be very much up to the individual player as to whether or not they are able to put up with the huge amount of problems the game has and enjoy what interesting bits it does have. So if during the course of this review you've looked at this game and gone, you know what, I think this might be up my alley, then I would recommend at least giving it a look. You can at least get the crappy VGA version on Steam and GOG right now. I'm hoping that GOG eventually gets a hold of an EGA copy, or at at least gets a hold of the audio drama. But right now, regardless of your platform, all you're going to be able to get is the VGA version unless you manage to track down an original copy where, well, good luck with that, I guess. But if you think you can put up with the problems, then I would recommend giving it a shot. But otherwise, again, it's a really hard game to recommend. I will have links in the video description box to where you can pick this up on Steam and GOG if you're interested, but I really do not recommend those versions. Get an original copy if you can, but if you can't, well, I guess they suffice. But otherwise, this game is just such a mixed bag that it's really hard to come to an ultimate conclusion on it. It's definitely interesting. It's one of the most unique adventure games I've ever played simply by nature of its interaction system and the fact that it's so weird, but it's definitely not for everyone. Thanks for watching.